So I'm just starting that now. I love that little announcement, and I'm just going to share my screen with you guys. And I do apologize if you hear my cat in the background. She is being crazy this morning, and she's just like running in and out of her little thing. So. All right, guys, so this is the renewal applicant launch meeting for the 2021 competition. The agenda for today, first we're going to go through a NOFA update. We're going to go over the scoring committee, all of the renewal agencies and the renewal funding process. Then we'll have room for questions, and then Christy will take it over and she will do the policies and procedures, the actual applications, and additional Q&A. So as far as a NOFA update, we do have indication from HUD that there will be a competitive NOFA. They have hinted that it will drop mid-July, so coming up here pretty quickly. And they've also indicated that there will be new money available. So that's really important. It's going to be a little bit different from the process last year, as we will be probably having to put out a new project RFP and solicit for new projects or expansions or things like that if they allow those. So we haven't heard anything official yet, but those are all of the conversations going on with all of the CoC funded agencies. Our scoring committee this year looks a little bit different than last year. We do have some new members that I'd like to thank for joining and getting involved in the process. We have Anna Viles from the Homes Campaign, Nisha Clark from the City of Wilmington Department of Real Estate and Housing, and Joni Patterson, who is on as a community volunteer. All of our other scoring committee members have served for several years, and they deserve the biggest round of applause because they decide to do this year in and year out. Devin Manning is our chair this year. We have Brandy Nauman from Sussex County, Fred Banuelos from Federal Home Loan Bank of Pittsburgh, Paula Witcher, who is a CoC board member, and veterans from the Veterans Multi-Service Center, and Peggy Strine, who is another community volunteer. So those are the members who approve the scoring tools, the policies and procedures, and will be reviewing your applications this year. Our 2021 renewal agencies include Child Inc. Right now, Connections is going through the process of turning into Connexio, so they will be coming in as a renewal as well. Family Promise of Northern Newcastle County, Housing Alliance Delaware, Ministry of Caring, West End Neighborhood House, and YWCA. So for the renewal funding process, here is our projected timeline for the way things will go from now until October. So today we're having the mandatory information meeting. Through July, you guys should have received a email yesterday for renewal applicant TA sessions. So we really want to provide those so that if you guys have any outstanding questions after the meeting today, or as you start to go through the applications and have more questions or need help with filling certain things out, we want to be able to provide that to you guys. So if you haven't already, please complete that doodle poll so we can get those scheduled through the month of July for you guys. And we are projecting that the NOFA will release in July as well. On July 30th, 2021 by 4 p.m., that is the deadline for the submission of all renewal applications. So all of the materials are due by 4 o'clock. Everybody should submit those to myself and to Felicia. And our emails are included a little bit later in the presentation. Through August 2021, that is the anticipated scoring committee review of renewal applicant submissions. And that is when we are anticipating the new project RFP if there's new money available. If there's new money available in September 21, that would be the anticipated new project review and also final scoring and ranking. And October 21 would take us to the consolidated application submission. And through here, we will probably offer additional TA in regards to eSnaps because it's looking like we are going to have to go through the eSnaps process this year. For project data, we use the HUD APR for the period of 4/1/2020 to 3/31/2021. That will be the evaluation period this year. You guys did receive those APRs for your projects on June 23rd from Felicia. If you haven't received them or if you need them to be resent, please just contact her. Her email is available there and several other times. These slides will also be available on the funding page. So competition APRs must be used when completing the renewal project applications. If you guys did have a data cleanup period this year that ended in May, so those final APRs were ran after the data cleanup period, and that will be the data used for your evaluation. Some application changes this year. So all of the forms are electronically fillable, meaning that you don't have to like print them out or anything. You can go through and just click all the boxes or answer in the little text boxes on the applications themselves. We thought that would make it a little bit easier for everybody to complete the applications this year. We also created one streamlined application. So we took the compliance tool and the valuation tool for all the projects, and we just combined it into one application for each project type. So that way there's not a bunch of different forms that you guys have to fill out and keep track of for all your projects. And finally, there's also a submission checklist. So we made this to make it easier for you guys to ensure that you have all of your supplemental documents and everything that needs to be turned in with the application. And it also details what needs to be submitted once per agency and what needs to be submitted with each individual project application. Supplemental form changes. So another additional change was we created a planning and participation form. Previously, this was on every renewal project application, but it's the same for agencies that have multiple projects. So we just created one form that can be submitted once instead of having to redo that every time you fill out an individual project application. And we created more in detail ELOC's draw instructions that also have like images and stuff so that you guys have available what exactly we need for your currently operating grant and your most recently expired grant in terms of draw information. Okay. For required submission materials, all the things that need to be submitted once per agency. So just one time, even if you have multiple projects, would be the grantee certification form, the planning and participation form, your financial audit, and if applicable, any findings or concerns or recommendations from that financial audit. Things that need to be submitted with each project application would be the actual project application by project type, the policies and procedures and data policies and procedures for that project, the draws for the most recently completed and currently operating grant term, if applicable, your HUD monitoring and corrective action plans. A new thing is consumer participation in policy making. So the CoC, through CoC funding, you're required to have somebody with lived experience as part of your decision making, whether that be a board or similar body. So we are asking for proof of that this year. And if you are going to be reallocating, the letter to voluntarily reallocate. For first-time renewals, first-time renewals only need to complete the compliance portion of the fiscal year 20 application. First-time renewals have not been in operation for a full 12 months. Therefore, they don't have enough data to be able to complete the evaluation portion of it. So the required submission materials for the first-time renewals will just be the certification form, the planning and participation form, as well as any audit information. I do believe we only have one first-time renewal coming into this competition, so we will reach out to you directly if you have more questions on that. How to submit. So again, the deadline is Friday, July 30th by 4 p.m. We will not accept anything after that. And earlier submissions are always welcome. And please submit all materials electronically to myself and Felicia. We just throughout any communications in regards to the competition, please just include us both. We just want to make sure we don't miss anything. And for the submission, so all of the documents that are only required once per agency can all be included in one email. Project applications and the corresponding supplemental documentation for those applications can be submitted in separate emails. So if you have 4 projects, I should be receiving 5 emails, 1 with all of your agency documents and 4 with all of the project documents. If they are large and you're having trouble submitting it through email, please just contact me. We can figure out a way to set up like a Google Drive or some other sharing method for me to receive those materials. I definitely don't want this to be a difficult process for you guys. So if you're having any issues at all, please just let me know. For an overview of the review process, so HAD CoC staff performs a first internal review of all the project applications, and that's to confirm the project outcomes and highlight any important information for the scoring committee to review. Submission materials are then set to DMA for a second review, and that's just to ensure all of the accuracy of the information. And Christy's amazing, so sometimes she might see some things that I don't when I'm doing my first review. After the first and second reviews, all the materials and the information coming out of the reviews is sent to the scoring committee for their review. After the scoring committee's review, they do meet, they determine project scores, and they send all of their final recommendations to the non-conflicted board members who have the final determination on scoring and ranking. And after the scores and ranks are released, then appeals may be submitted after that. And Christy will go into more detail about the appeals process. All right, so before we get to questions, I just have some final notes here. All materials, including today's recording and slides and all of that, can be found on this CoC funding page. It's linked here. Again, all submission or funding related questions should be directed to both myself and Felicia. And if you haven't already filled out the doodle poll for the TA meetings in July, please do so because we really want to make sure that you guys have all the information that you need. And that would be the end. So if anybody has any questions before we move on to Christy's presentation, feel free to unmute yourself and I'd be happy to answer any of them.
Hey, good morning, Erin. This is Deanna with Child Inc. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Good. Forgive my ignorance. This is actually our first time renewing, but I don't know. I think that you said if it's 12 months or less, and there's only one agency, this is their first time renewing.
Yes. So Child Inc., this project has been in operation for over a year as far as the grant term. So you guys will be coming in as a regular renewal. You came in as a first time renewal last year.
Understood.
Any other questions before we move on, guys? Okay. Christy, feel free to take it away.
Hi, everybody. Sorry, I'm just getting my screen set up. Screens. So hopefully everyone can see my PowerPoint at this point. And we'll just jump right in. Again, I'm Christy Rubenstein. I'm a Senior Associate with DMA, and we are providing consulting services to the CoC for the CoC competition, and that includes this scoring process. I assisted last year, so hopefully I'm becoming more familiar, and I'm becoming more familiar with all of your projects as well. So we're moving ahead and doing, I think, pretty well. So the good news is we're starting this process in advance of a NOFA. That might not feel like good news to all of you right now, but it is good news because it gives you some space to concentrate on this before we have to jump into other parts of the NOFA process. And what I'm going to do is cover the funding policy that has been approved and passed by the board and the scoring committee, and also talk through the renewal evaluation application process and the different aspects of the criteria that you're going to be evaluated on. So again, what I'm really going to do when I talk through this is focus on changes from the prior year. I'll give a sort of broad overview of a lot of this stuff, but I will try to really point out where something is different from last year so that you're aware of those differences when you're going through this process. And that will be for both the CoC funding policy side, and then also when we start to talk through the application and scoring tools, the evaluation metrics, those things, I will be calling out very specifically how things are a little bit different from last year or where it's not different at all. And so it's pretty much as you would expect. I'm happy to take questions throughout. I know that as I move through this, it's going to be the case, especially when we talk about the criteria, that you might have questions about the specifics of each criteria. So feel free to ask questions. You can use the chat box. You can unmute and ask your question. If you do unmute, we ask that you just mute yourself again once you're finished talking, so we avoid lots of background noise. But feel free to ask those questions. I will also have breaks throughout in case something doesn't occur to you right away, but then it pops into your mind later. We'll have time for Q&A throughout, and then also at the end. All right, so let's jump into the funding policy for 2021, which covers a variety of aspects of the CoC NOFA competition process. So if you'll recall, in 2020, we pulled together a bunch of different sort of documents and policies that had been in place in 2019 and perhaps in prior years, right? And we pulled those together into sort of one policies document. And that's really the basis for the 2021 policies as well. So that worked well last year in 2020. So we really worked with that document and tweaked it here and there, but by and large, it follows very similar sort of outline and setup to the 2020 policies. And so it has these different sections, which include a background section, a section on the CoC scoring committee, which is a little new, conflicts of interest, project prioritization and ranking, new project solicitation, evaluation and selection, renewal project evaluation, fund reallocation, appeals, and corrective action plans. And then there's a list of revisions at the end. So those are sort of the main pieces of the CoC sort of project process, renewals, new project selection, all that good stuff. So let's start with, at the top with the CoC program competition background section, which really is just a brief overview of the CoC NOFA process. Why the heck do we have this policy? Why are we doing this kind of stuff? Really just goes back to saying, hey, how does this NOFA? And we kind of have to do it this way. Again, it describes the need to review, score, rank projects. And we did reflect some of the sort of strangeness of our 2020 renewal process, which was that there wasn't a sort of more normal CoC NOFA competition, right? It was this auto renew. So that's one tweak that we made just because of the way the language works. And we're referencing them back to FY19 in that background piece saying, well, we expect this year, 21, to be more like 2019. And so we're really looking back to that as our sort of baseline. There's a section on the scoring committee. It's a little bit of a new section. It just sort of broke it out and really outlines the role of the scoring committee, and sort of just clearly states this is the group that's going to do the review of the tools, the applications. It's going to score projects, going to rank projects. That's kind of just calling out their role, and also really clearly states it has to be a non-conflicted group, right? A group of people that are not receiving CoC funds, and so therefore they're able to participate in this sort of decision making because they don't have a stake in it, financially speaking. So the next section, again, because this is important for everyone to be clear about the need for non-conflicted folks to be participating in the decision-making process, there is the conflict of interest policy. And so it's a really good policy. It kind of clearly states what's allowed, what's not allowed in terms of conflicts of interest, and provides some examples of conflicts that may arise. Also requires that the scoring committee and CoC board fill out a form basically attesting to the fact that they don't have any conflicts, and that if one does arise during the course of the year, so they have to do that annually, but if something happens, they change jobs and suddenly they're with an organization, right, that is a CoC funded agency, then they have to disclose that conflict right away. And then they can no longer be a part of those decision-making processes, right? And then it also calls out that the lead agency, which is Housing Alliance Delaware, right, is barred from participating in discussion or voting on matters in which they receive funding. So clearly states that as well. The project prioritization and ranking policy really has minimal changes from FY20. So we're pretty much following along with the same. Again, we had to make some tweaks in language because of the strangeness of the renewal process in 20 and the fact that we actually don't have a NOFA yet. So in prior years, all of this would have been done after a NOFA was released, but you're ahead of the game this year. So just little tweaks in language here and there. The policy itself, again, assigns duties to the scoring committee and provides a basic overview of areas for which projects will be reviewed. So like very generally, like we'll review threshold, right? And compliance, that kind of stuff. It also specifies which projects will be ranked in tier 1 right off the bat, right? So, and those include first year renewals. And the reason for that is because HUD actually says you can't reallocate a first year renewal. So they have to go in so they would be safe in tier 1 until they're no longer a first year renewal. The other two project types that are going to be ranked in tier 1 would be the SSOCE project. So that's your centralized intake funding, and HMIS, which is your CMIS funding. So those are considered sort of basic CoC infrastructure. They'll be ranked in tier 1. They will be reviewed and they will be scored, but there will be other processes also to evaluate those and to address any issues that come up. Ranking then within tiers will be based on the scores from the scoring tool, the project's performance, CoC priorities and local need, and then competitiveness of tier 2 projects nationally. What does that mean? It means that, so for everything in tier 1's kind of your safe area, right? Anything that goes into tier 1 is going to get funding. But then there's this group of projects which will be in what is called tier 2. Tier 2 is those projects are competing nationally for sort of whatever funds HUD has left over after they fund everything in tier 1. And then the way that works is there's this like crazy formula that HUD applies, and part of it's based on how your CoC scores on the consolidated application, and part of it's based on the budget of the project's ranked above it in tier 2. So all of that comes together to give a score. And that score is the basis for whether the project will get funded, because HUD will fund all that they can, and when they run out of money, they have to kind of draw a line, and anything above that score gets funding, anything below does not. And so that's part of this sort of tier 2 strategy, is for the CoC to think about, well, how can we stack projects in tier 2 to be the most competitive, bring the most funding back to our CoC to try to ensure that all of the projects that we really want funded do get funded. So they can consider that as part of the ranking as well. The one last thing here is that HAD cannot participate in discussions or deliberations regarding prioritization issues that may impact their funding. So that's called out, as we can see, multiple times in the overall policies document. All right, new project solicitation, evaluation, and selection. Did not get an opportunity to use this last year to actually implement it because there was no new funding last year and there was no process for that. So there were no real changes to this. Again, this policy, it describes the process used to select new projects. And the basic sort of outline here is that the CoC will issue an open RFP or solicitation or bid, whatever words you want to use in any given year, but it will be an open competition for whatever new funds are available. And it outlines the documents that applicants have to sort of submit and the process in general. So all of that's in this policy. Again, it assigns duties to Housing Alliance, to the scoring committee, and to the CoC board, who's going to do what. So Housing Alliance is really going to be responsible for collecting applications, reviewing the eligibility requirements. The scoring committee is going to review eligibility again, score projects, to make selection and ranking recommendations that they will then send on to the board, and then the board reviews all of that information and decides if they agree with the scoring committee's recommendations or if they would do something different. The new project evaluation factors that are sort of listed in the policy include that the projects should address an unmet need. They'll look at the quality of the organization and management plan to administer the project, the capacity of the organization to actually operate that specific project type that they're applying for using best practices, the experience and capacity of the organization with grant administration, because we all have the joy of working with HUD grants. There's a lot of grant administration here. Ability to move households into permanent housing quickly. And then other factors identified in the RFP kind of have to leave that open because we don't have a NOFA and we don't know exactly what HUD will allow and what HUD will require. And so some of those things that we will only know once we have a NOFA will be worked into the RFP and will be included as evaluation factors. All right, renewal project evaluation. So this is why you're all here. This is the part that very clearly is related to your work. So the policy again outlines how this sort of renewal evaluation process will unfold. There were revisions to parts of this to just try to make more clear what's considered, say, threshold and what's not, and what would happen if you don't meet threshold, and those kinds of fun things. And then to just better describe the process for all of you. So we kind of went through the process in 2020, came back and said, I think we can tweak this here and there to make it even better and more clear for everyone, clearer for everybody. So again, we're clarifying what is considered to be threshold, and that not meeting threshold is really the grounds for being placed on a corrective action plan, right? Outline the data cleanup process and the use of HAD generated APR as the data to be used for evaluation. Talk about how the SSOC and HMIS projects will be reviewed as directed by the scoring committee, because again, a lot of this is about HAD, the Housing Alliance staff and sort of their role in administering the renewal evaluation, but they cannot do that for their own projects. So that's at the discretion of the scoring committee to figure out how those will be evaluated. Then it also assigns duties to Housing Alliance, to the scoring committee and the CoC board, very similar to what we talked about with the new project selection process. Again, HAD's going to be the one, the agency collecting applications and documentation, as Erin discussed, when we're doing this sort of initial reviews and accepting them for their own projects. And then that information will get passed along to the scoring committee. They're going to evaluate all the projects using the scoring tools that they've approved and developed. They're going to review the status of the corrective action plans, make recommendations for ranking, reallocation, and projects needing a corrective action plan for the next year. And then the CoC board will receive all of that information. They'll review the scoring committee's recommendations, and then they get to make the final decisions. So you have this sort of multiple sort of bodies looking at this in different groups. And so that's nice because you kind of have like, you have a good sizable scoring committee as well. And so this doesn't hinge on just like one person making a decision, but there are lots of people looking at this, weighing the decisions, and sort of evaluating all these factors. Agencies are provided with the right to appeal scoring, but not ranking, but scoring appeals will be discussed in the appeals section. So again, when we talk about this idea of meeting renewal project threshold requirements, what are those? They're defined as the one, you have to submit your application material. So that's step one. And then the financials are considered threshold, no significant unresolved audit or monitoring findings. And the funds, you can't have more than 0.25% of funds recaptured. Anything above that would trigger a review, right? So spend your money, folks. Compliance, again, this is basically a lot of grant management stuff and really looking at, are you following CoC interim rule and HERTH regulations? Are you serving eligible clients? Are you actually eligible to receive CoC funds? Lots of fun stuff like that. And then performance is separate, not necessarily not considered threshold. Performance is assessed through the use of the evaluation and scoring tools. So that's a separate piece. All right, the reallocation policy. So again, reallocation is a fancy word for saying when funds are taken away from a project and put to another use. So there were no significant changes to this policy from the FY20 version. We did clarify some things just around the tweaking language here and there. Again, we're talking about there are different kinds of reallocation. An agency can voluntarily reallocate. That's where the agency says, hey, I actually don't want to operate this project anymore. I want to return the funds, or I actually have trouble spending down all my money and there's a portion of this I want to return back to the CoC. So that's where the agency kind of takes that step and sort of says, hey, I'm going to give you back some money. So that's voluntary. And that process, as Erin noted, really is that the agency would notify the CoC lead agency in writing. That's the letter we talked about going in with your application submission. If you are interested in voluntarily reallocating, to put that in writing in the letter and submit that. And then the lead agency is obligated to then turn that information over to the board and let the board know, because the board's really the one that's going to make most of the decisions regarding reallocation. If the project does not meet threshold requirements or the CoC's established needs, priorities, or HUD priorities, it can also be subject to reallocation. So the CoC has that right to say, oh, well, this project isn't performing well consistently. We just don't think it's going to work anymore. And so we're going to reallocate. Or, you know, this project isn't meeting the needs of the folks in the CoC anymore, the clients. And so we need to reallocate. These are all reasons why HUD says CoCs should consider reallocation. So the scoring committee would determine which projects are not meeting threshold or not meeting the priorities or needs. That's really something they get to do, but then they have to pass it on to the board, and they have to provide really specific reasons to the board as to like, what is it about this project that would lead to funds being reallocated? And then the board will review that, and they get to make the final determination regarding whether the reallocation would go forward and for how much. Is it full reallocation, partial, all the details. Agencies are provided with the right to appeal reallocation decisions. These are not decisions to be made lightly. And so it's important for the agency to have that opportunity to appeal that decision. In terms of what happens with the funds after the reallocation decision is made. It sort of depends on whether it's a voluntary reallocation or not. In the case where it is a voluntary reallocation, again, the board will have the right to sort of determine whether that pot of money that an agency comes in and says, I want to reallocate funds, whether it could go right back to that agency for another use. But the board might also decide, well, no, we don't want to do that. In that case, the funding would go out to bid, essentially, right, through a solicitation process. For funds that are reallocated sort of involuntarily, right, we're talking about it, again, going out through a solicitation process. Now, that might be in the course of a CoC NOFA competition when you have bonus funds. Reallocated funds could be part of that solicitation, right? Could be part of the bucket of funds that are considered, out there for new projects. Or the CoC could say, you know what, we reallocated funds from a very specific project and we kind of want to replicate the same thing, or we have a reason for having a special RFP or solicitation process. And they could make that decision as well. And so there could be a separate solicitation for that pot of money. So they have all these options available to them. There is recusal language in the policy as well. And again, HAD can't participate in discussions or deliberations regarding their own projects, and CoC board members with conflicts cannot participate in reallocation discussions or decisions. All right, the appeal policy. So there's a general appeal policy. Instead of the policies being embedded in the different sort of sections, that was just to help sort of make it a little more clear. There's an appeal policy. So that was done in FY20 and then again carried over. Not a lot of changes here. I will note the one change that was made, but appeals from renewal projects are allowed for the same set as for last year: project scoring errors, reallocation of CoC funding, and then improper application interpretation of HUD CoC rules regulations concerning the participation of the applicant in the CoC application process. That sort of tracks very much with HUD's appeal policy as well. So appeals, this is the new thing, appeals from new project applicants are also going to be allowed this year. So say you came in for a new project and you didn't get selected, and you receive a letter from the CoC that says, we are not selecting your project for these reasons. And the CoC has to give you reasons according to the NOFA rules. And so what we're saying this year is that those who are rejected can file an appeal, but it has to be sort of a factual rebuttal of the reasons why the application was not selected. So it can't just be like, I don't think this is fair. It has to kind of go back to respond to whatever the decision was and the reasons given. As far as the process goes, the agencies will have 3 days from decision to submit the appeal in writing, and you have to use the form that the CoC will issue. And then the CoC board, the non-conflicted members, have 7 days to follow up, essentially, to do their work, to investigate, to follow up, and then to respond back to those filing the appeal. This might be done electronically. Sometimes we're really rushing due to the time frame, the crunch time frame involved. So they do have the right to conduct all of this electronically. And certainly we're living in that age. We're all here on this Zoom, right? So that's also in the policy. And then agencies that aren't satisfied can always look to the latest NOFA, read through the appeal options there, and appeal to HUD under HUD's rules for appeal. So that's always an option for folks. Corrective action plans. Again, there's a policy that really just outlines the corrective action plan process, clearly states what HAD is responsible for doing, and then what the agency is, and sort of talks about how the corrective action plan needs to be set up. They will identify the performance issue, define goals, performance goals, specify activities needed to address those performance issues, who's going to do what and by when, setting deadlines and all that great stuff to help keep everything on track. The agency is ultimately responsible for implementing those changes to address the performance issues, but HAD will provide TA. We'll meet with the agency to review it. It's not, HAD isn't going to draw up a corrective action plan and hand it down. It is a process of working with the agency to talk through those issues. And again, to provide TA and sort of work with the agency to try to really address whatever the underlying issues are. And then the scoring committee would be notified of like the progress of the correction action plans as part of the sort of renewal review. They'll be taking a look at everybody's corrective action plans if you were placed on one. So that's it. There are questions. I see there's some stuff in the chat. I don't know if folks have been getting their questions answered by Erin or others.
Yep. The first question was receiving the PowerPoint presentations. So we will be sending them out to everybody directly. And I also included the link to the funding page, which is where all of the materials will be posted. And then Matt had a question that said, where can we learn more about when an issue with threshold requirements leads to a corrective action plan versus escalates to recommendation to reallocate? And he said, outside of the reallocation policy, it's determined by the scoring committee through a variety of factors, such as the nature of the threshold issue, previous corrective action, and more. And then the scoring committee would make, off of those factors, would make a recommendation to the board, and then the board would make the final decision. So those were the only two questions that we got in the chat so far.
Any other questions? Folks listen to me talk a lot. Okay. And then Erin, I just a note that I did make some tweaks to this presentation, so make sure I give you the latest and greatest to distribute and to post. Nothing really crazy. All right, so we'll move on, but if anything comes up as I'm talking through the next section, please feel free to return any questions that you might have when we have our sort of final Q&A. And obviously you can always follow up with Erin and others to gain clarity if there's anything along the way, right? As you're actually filling out your applications or something and you have questions. Okay, so let's talk about the renewal project evaluation and scoring tools. And the ones we're going to focus on are the ones that most of you are operating, not the stuff that HAD does. So we're talking about permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, transitional housing, and the transitional housing to rapid rehousing joint component. So Erin went through a lot of this stuff, but just to, again, just highlight again that the renewal project application has been revised. There are still specific applications for each project type, so be sure that you're working in the application that relates to the project type for the project type that you're submitting. So if you have a variety, say you have a rapid and you have a PSH, just make sure when you're sitting down with the application, you're doing the right application for your project. The compliance and evaluation tools have been combined into a single application, as Erin noted. So kudos to her for doing all the work to bring that in. And they're great. There's like fillable forms, and it's I think very clear and put together very well. Again, the application checklist, be sure that you read through that and that you follow that. I'll touch on that in certain places because I think it's important for certain things like the policies and procedures to make sure that you've read through what the policies and procedures are supposed to have in them, and then make sure that what you're submitting covers all of that. The scoring tool, there are separate scoring tools, right, for each project type. And that's where you're going to see the benchmarks and the point allocations for meeting the different benchmarks. So you'll have your application, but if you want to have a better sense of how am I actually going to score, pull the scoring tool as well and kind of get an assessment. You could even like sort of fake score yourself, right, on the APR driven stuff and kind of see like, oh, I got when I did the calculation, I got 50% here. Would I get points or not, right? You can kind of figure that out using those scoring tools. Again, there's this planning and participation form, so that's new. Make sure you submit that. And then just a reminder of the deadline, and be sure you don't miss the deadline. It's important to get all your materials in on time. All right, so what does this application sort of have in it now? Because it's sort of a longish document. Well, there's a certification, not to be confused with the grantee certification form, which is a separate form. But as part of the application, you're filling out all this stuff. But in the beginning, there's a spot where you're going to certify like everything that I've turned in here and said in this application, it's all true and accurate. That has to get signed. So make sure that you have your stuff together in a way to make sure that you get the signature you need to be able to send that along to Erin in a timely manner. There is a whole section on project information. So all of that is just the basics of your project, right? What type of project is this? How many units or beds? How many households are served? What types of households do you serve? What's the geography served? What's the composition? What kind of units? Are they scattered site? Are they SRO? So all of that fun stuff is sort of in the front loaded in the beginning. You'll just click through that. Some of you may not know specifics around some of these things. So I encourage you throughout the application, if there are parts where you actually are not the keeper of that information, to make sure that you give yourself the time to go find that information from the person who does know, right? So you might not be the person who knows a lot about the different types of unit compositions and stuff like that, or how many exactly households are being served or what kind they are. And if you're not that person, go find that person in your organization so that you can provide accurate information on this part. The other thing is there's a project budget. We'll talk about that, but you have to fill that in as well. The compliance review part is several pages long, and that covers all the really exciting stuff, the grant management and compliance with HUD rules. There's a list here, we'll talk about it more, but that's a lot of the sort of like the name implies, compliance review. It's really about the CoC rules, interim, the CoC interim rule, and are you complying with all those fun grant management pieces. Performance evaluation is where we really get into your data and your participant outcomes. Okay, so that's where we're really focusing on the APR, and then also covering things around housing first, low barrier support services, and that kind of stuff. Okay, so again, the certification, make sure you get that signature. And the project information, different project types sometimes ask for different information. So just be aware when you're in the different applications that you might need different information. Be sure to complete all the questions and tables. It can be sometimes like, oh, I don't know the answer to that. Skip to the next one and never come back. Make sure that you're highlighting if you needed to come back to something. And then be sure to complete that project budget. The budget includes the budget line items from the HUD grant application, but there are also a couple of other budget tables included, including one on other public funds and then private funds and in-kind resources. Those were always included, but they were sort of at the back end of a different piece of the application. So it's been brought up to the project information section. So just be sure that you have all that information pulled together to be able to fill that in. The compliance review. Okay, so these are all the pieces that it covers. I'm going to highlight the things that are tweaked really from last year, but it's going to cover match, it's going to cover your drawdown rate, it's going to cover timely APR submission, your HUD monitoring. What is different this year is that we're going to ask for monitoring if it has occurred in the last 2 years, not just sort of the last year. Financial audit, again, as Erin noted, now asking if you have not just findings, but recommendations or concerns as a result of the audit related to the CoC sort of funds. For corrective action plan, agencies placed on a corrective action plan as part of FY20 have to provide information and update on how things are going with your corrective action plan. Fair housing compliance, they took away a question, but then added in a new question asking about whether fair housing complaints have been filed against the project by any consumers. So again, if you're not the person who would know that, you need to track down who is the person who would know that. Age and gender participation compliance hasn't changed. Consumer participation in policymaking, as Erin noted before, the change here is that we're asking agencies to submit a list of board members and indicate which is participating as the homeless, formerly homeless individual on your board or other decision-making, policymaking body. So that is, that is different. Equal access compliance, the same. CMIS participation, same question. Housing first, low barrier, revised as well, okay? The questions here were reworked, and there are also questions in the performance evaluation. Now the difference here is on this part, we're really asking the agency to look at the questions that are included on the renewal application that you have to apply through eSNAPs, right? So when you do your renewal for HUD in eSNAPs, there are a series of questions that HUD uses to assess whether your project is going to be considered sort of housing first, low barrier compliant. Those are the questions that we've put into this. And we're asking you, are you doing these things now? And then do you commit to doing them in FY21? So that's what these questions here in the compliance section are about. So read through it, just make sure you understand it. If you have any questions, you can always follow up in your TA session. All right, CI participation, client eligibility, those are the same. For client eligibility, we got some interesting responses last year. I urge folks to read through that question, take it seriously, and think about what you're writing. Because when you write stuff that is indicative of you're taking clients that are not aligned with the CoC's process, could be problematic. So make sure that you're not just whipping through some of these questions, but being thoughtful in your response. And then for DV projects, there is a question around safety planning, the same as last year. All right, any questions on that before I move forward? So compliance section covered a lot of stuff. And those are the things that can get you flagged for a corrective action plan for sure. So if anybody has any questions about any of those things, feel free to ask. Okay. So we'll move on to the performance evaluation section. All right, so here is a table that basically shows all the different criteria, the project type, and sort of what the point value is if it is to be scored or not. The little star next to something just means it's new, and that's why it's not scored this year. And NA means that it is not applicable to that project type. So as you'll notice, there are only 95 points as the base for rapid rehousing and transitional housing. We actually did some modeling to see if this makes a big difference. It doesn't. So we ended up saying, you know, this is okay, rather than inflating the point values of some things where it just didn't make sense. So that's where we're at. It's 100 for PSH, 100 for TH to RH, and then 95 point base for rapid and transitional. All right, our first one that applies to all the project types is data quality. This was not really changed from last year. Last year was a change in that prior it had been all or nothing in terms of points. And last year kind of separated out that you don't have to be perfect on everything to get partial points. So you do have to meet the less than 5% errors threshold on all of them, all the data elements listed in the table to get the 10 points. But if you do that for 10 to 14 of the data elements, you can get half points. And so that, again, hasn't changed from last year. Data timeliness is new for FY21 and it is not scored for FY21. So look through your data and make sure that you stay on top of this as we move into the next year, because you're already, right, your review period's likely to be starting in April 1st. So be thinking about this for the time you're in now. But in the meantime, what the CoC is looking for is that start and exit records are entered in less than or equal to 3 days. So you're going to be asked to report that out. Again, you're not going to be scored on this year. You will in future years. So keep that in mind. Housing stability, again, applies to all the project types, but it's different for PSH than it is for rapid TH and TH to RH. And the difference here is that for PSH, we factor in retention. So what do we mean by housing stability? This is the rate of persons who exit to a permanent housing destination. And then for PSH, it's exit to a permanent housing destination or are retained in the project. Because it's permanent supportive housing, and that is how retention of folks in PSH is also considered a positive outcome. And so again, the sort of method is different for PSH, but across all of them, the benchmarks are the same and the point value is the same. We've been with this new APR for a while, but I always call out the fact that the table we're pulling from is 23C. There used to be an A and a B, those went away, and now it's C, and it's all aligned with CAPER, and it's wonderful, it's great. There are a group of destinations that are excluded. So if you had folks who exited to foster care home or group foster care home, hospital or other residential non-psychiatric medical facility, long-term care facility or nursing home, or were deceased, they will be pulled out from your base, right? They're not going to be factored in. So that comes from HUD. Those are the things that HUD excludes when they calculate this for the APR and also for the system performance measures. And so we follow their guidance and their lead on that. All right, length of stay. This one applies only to TH and TH to RH, and for TH to RH, it's only the TH component really. But length of stay is 22C in terms of the APR table. The point value is different because the TH to RH component project application rate has more questions because you're combining pieces of both the TH and the RH. So it's less value for TH to RH, higher value for TH. The sort of benchmarks are pretty much the same. And we're looking at this both for stayers and leavers, but separately for stayers and leavers. And so for TH, it's a total of 10 points, 5 points for stayers, 5 points for leavers. To get the full 5 points, you have to have your average length of stay less than 180 days. And then it can be from 180 days to 365 days for the half points. Same sort of principle for the TH to RH. It's just worth half the points, so that all the point values get cut in half there. All right, length of time from project enrollment to move-in. So this one has been around, and it's a different table for the next project type. So give me a minute, but we're going to talk about rapid rehousing, which is scored, and it's going to be applied to PSH, but not this year. So it's new for PSH this year, so it's not scored this year for PSH. So all the scoring is really just for rapid on this slide. So for rapid, the housed within dates are within 30 days and 60 days. So 20% of the persons, 20% or more of the persons housed within 30 days will get you 10 points. If you don't meet that benchmark, right, but you have 40% of the persons housed within 60 days, you can get half points, you can get 5 points. So that's how this works. It's a little different for our TH to RH. The days are different, right? So for TH to RH, to get the 10 points, you need 30% or more of the person's house within 60 days. And then for 5 points, 60% or more of person's house within 180 days. So again, make sure you're in the right application because the table is different, asking you for different things if you're depending on your project type. Okay, increased or maintained income. Now this one's different for everybody. Because what it used to be is based on levers. And for most of the project types, it was only increased income, and maintained was included for PSH. So this has been streamlined. It's the same for all the project types. And we're looking at increased or maintained income, and we're looking at stayers and leavers. So we're asking you to put a lot of information, but it's pretty streamlined, and it's the same thing for every project type this year, and same point values and same thresholds, benchmarks. So that's nice. A little less confusing. For stayers who have not been in the project for a year, they're not eligible to really have their annual assessment done, so they get pulled out, they get excluded. You'll put that information in, no worries there. Even if you're a rapid rehousing project, don't worry about it. Those folks will get excluded. And for you in a rapid rehousing, if your folks are mostly cycling in less than a year, they're all going to be counted as leavers. So it'll all work out in the end. The point values, it's 10 points across the board, and 70% to 100% will get you full points, 50 to 70 to 69% will get you half points, and then anything under 50%, unfortunately, you don't get any points. But again, we're including maintained, and so that's probably good news for most folks.
Christy here, I would just like to add that we changed that metric this year in light of COVID-19 to assist all projects. So we did do quite an in-depth data review, like de-identified data review ahead of time to make sure that benchmarks and everything were going to be fair. And the scoring committee decided that including maintained for leavers and stayers would be fair for everyone this year in light of the hardships through the pandemic.
Yeah, and again, you know, a lot of this, I didn't say this from the outset, but we did pull a lot of data and look through the actual data that we have, particularly because of concerns around COVID and how COVID might impact some of these metrics and really the benchmarks. So the benchmarks have been tweaked throughout to kind of reflect the circumstances that you're actually working in. It could change in future years because we'll keep doing that kind of analysis in future years to always understand whether the benchmarks are sort of aligned with sort of what's going on in the community and what are reasonable expectations for performance based on those factors, right? So that's going to be part of the regular CoC process. And so while this is the way it was done this year, those can always be tweaked in future years as well. All right, mainstream non-cash benefits. This would be, this is a new one. It's again, not scored because it's new. And it's a fairly simple metric where we will be asking for stayers and leavers with 1+ source of benefits. There, again, it's not scored. We have these sort of preliminary benchmarks, again, based on data, which really it's the same as the income, to be honest. But again, not scored. So you can kind of get a sense of, am I in the ballpark for getting full points when this is scored next time around? But we'll always be checking in on that data part too. And again, this is just really straightforward, and the adults who have not yet had an annual assessment will be pulled out, but all other adults will be counted. Okay, bed unit utilization. So this is not being scored in FY21 due to COVID. This is one that that HAD would pull together the data anyway. So it's not something you're going to pull from the APR. The HAD staff typically would calculate this and then provide it. But due to all the sort of wackiness of the last year in terms of people filling beds or not filling beds, or the types of beds you have, and could they be filled, and is it a shared stay, all the sort of craziness. The decision was made by the scoring committee to not score it for this cycle, but we're keeping it here because it will return and get scored again in future years. So not this year, but be mindful of your utilization as you move forward, and be working and connecting with HAD if you're having issues with utilization. All right, severity of need, disabling condition. So I'll give my spiel about severity of need, what severity of need is or isn't. Severity of need is not performance in the traditional way. Severity of need is really in the CoC NOFA competition. HUD says to CoCs, when you're doing this rating and ranking thing, you should factor in the rate at which projects have participants that have barriers and high needs, right? High barriers, high needs, they're less likely to have great outcomes because of those things. You have to factor them in. And so we're going to talk through the next three criteria, this one and then two others that fall under this sort of severity of need bucket, right? Where HUD is trying to assess like, oh, are the folks you're serving, are a lot of the folks in that project sort of high need folks, right? And so we're using certain things as like proxies for that. But this is pretty standard across all CoCs are kind of using the same group of severity of need metrics. So for PSH and not for the others, for this CoC, we look at disabling conditions, okay? And what we're looking at is the rate of adults with 1+ disabling conditions at start. We are not looking at, it's 1+ because there are no judgments here about one person's one condition might be really debilitating and someone else might have 3 conditions, but may not be, you know, so we don't make any judgments about that. So we're just looking at 1+ disabling conditions, okay? The table, I will say, is a large table. Be sure you're pulling the data from the right column. What we're asking for is adults without children and adults in households with children and adults. Why? Because we're focused on the adults and not the kids. So we're pulling the data just on the adults. Just be sure that you're pulling the data from the right columns when you go through and put this data. Again, this is 10 points, 80 to 100% will get you the full points. 60 to 79% is 5 points, and then 0 points for under 60%. Fleeing DV, this severity of need metric does not apply to PSH, applies to the others, right? So we have rapid TH to RH, are the project types that this one applies to. Now, fleeing DV is again applicable to adults and heads of households, and at project start, it is different from, there are 2 tables here. 14A is a history of DV, 14B is fleeing DV. We're pulling the data from 14B. This one's worth 5 points. The benchmarks are set quite low, again, based on the actuals that we see. So over 5% is 5 points, 2 to 5% is 3 points, and then under 2% is no points. Similarly, the next severity of need, 0 income at entry, applies to rapid TH/THRH. Again, it's worth 5 points. This one we're pulling from question 20, and again at entry, those who are entering the project with 0 income. If you have over 20% of participants entering without income, that will get you 5 points. 10 to 20% is 3 points, and under that 10% is 0. Okay, chronic homeless dedicated prioritized. And this one, Erin might jump in. She should feel free. Had lots of discussion about this. This one has two parts to the question. The first part is for all the projects out there who have dedicated beds. If you're a PSH project, again, this is PSH only. And if you have dedicated your beds to chronic, and you will fill out the first table. If you are one of the few projects that instead of dedicating prioritized beds, you're going to be filling out the 9A table. So just know what bucket you fit into. Again, if you're not the person who's the keeper of that information, go find out who is and be able to fill that in. What we're looking for is 100% dedicated or prioritized. That gets you 5 points. And if not, there are no points. The note here is that for those of you who do have prioritized beds, this is not really a thing anymore in the renewal application. Instead, you're asked to whether your beds are going to be dedicated. And then there's something called dedicated plus, which we're not going to talk about today. It's a long conversation. But what the CoC is looking for is folks to dedicate beds. And there's going to be more conversation with you about that if you are an agency that has prioritized beds instead of dedicated beds. So HAD staff will talk to you. So just clarifying again, the total point value for this one is 5. You can only get 5 points, and you can get 5 points if you're 100% dedicated, 5 points if you're 100% prioritized. Did I get all that right, Erin? Okay, I'm really happy. Okay, chronically homeless households served. Again, this one applies only to PSH. And pretty straightforward. We'll pull from question 26A. And this one is one where the HAD staff is aware that some folks might have people who are not going to be captured in the table for one reason or another. You can provide a narrative for any client who's not does not meet the chronic homeless definition. Be sure to read through the instructions and to give the HAD staff the information that they need so that they can do the checks that they need to do on their end and factor that information in to the calculation. So just be aware if you got folks in the project who you already know, like got some kind of waiver or something, that's where you're going to use the narrative under there to input that information. And then the scoring for this one is 90 to 100%, you get 10 points, 80 to 89%, 5 points, and less than that would be, less than 80 would be no points. All right, so here's where there was a big change from the prior year in the application. Housing first and low barrier. So first, they used to be separate questions. We've combined them into one. So it is a housing first and low barrier question. This applies to all project types. And the way it's now structured is a series of 10 questions that are worth 2 points each. The point value hasn't changed. The housing first question was worth 10 points and the low barrier question was worth 10 points in the prior rounds, right? So total, when they're combined, it was 20 points and we're still at 20 points. The questions are set up as a series of sort of like yes, no questions plus a narrative. You're going to be asked to write 3 to 5 sentences. Sort of, you'll read through the question, say yes, no, we do this, we don't do this. And then you're going to have to write an explanation of like how you do it, right? And provide some specifics. And you have to, I guess my biggest tip is provide the information that's relevant to the question you're in. So you might start to like run together all these questions, but really focus on the specifics of the question that you're reading and provide a narrative that's really reflective and relevant to that specific question. All right, so the other piece of this is that you have to submit your policies and procedures, right, as part of your application package. And please note the list of things that your policies and procedures should cover, because this is the stuff the scoring committee is going to read through and try to match up with your responses here on housing first, low barrier, and also support services. So they're really going to be looking at your policies and procedures and saying, hey, they've said this. Now, when we look at their policies and procedures, does that like get backed up by what they've just said, right? Does that back it up? Is that reflected here? So there are 2 parts of this. And so just be aware that to the extent that you can point out in your narrative, well, here in the policies and procedures is where you'll find this, that would be really helpful. So take your time, be thoughtful, read through them. Again, this is a total of 20 points with each question, each list item worth 2 points. And within that, what the scoring committee is going to be looking for is not just that you said yes or you filled in a narrative. They're going to read through it all. They're looking for that you said yes, that your narrative is aligned with housing first and low barrier and relevant, and that your policies and procedures back it up. If you don't have all of that together, you're going to get no points for that particular list item. So you could get some points for, you could get 2 points for some list items, no points for others. So you can come out of here with partial points, but just be aware that that's how the scoring here is going to work. And here is sort of the list, and I'll just read through one example. I'll do number 4, participation in services or compliance with treatment programs is not a condition of staying in the housing program. You would click yes or no, and then you would write a narrative very specifically about that particular issue, right? So again, just be aware of that. And here's the rest. If you answer no to any of them, you're going to have to provide a narrative to talk about, well, how are you going to kind of be able to sort of get more housing first and low barrier compliant in the future. Support services is similarly revised. It's a little bit different. It's a series of 5 questions worth 2 points each. Some of them have a narrative, some don't. They're not, it's not all like yes, no stuff for the support services. So again, read through it, sort of think about it. I really highly encourage everyone to read through these definitely prior to your meeting, your TA session with HAD. And if you have any questions about what these things mean, then like that's an opportunity to talk through that. Like, what are you really looking for here? And again, the scoring committee is going to go back to the policies and procedures, and having worked with them last year, we really do pull out the policies and procedures and start reading through that stuff to see where it aligns and supports what your answer is, right? So just be aware of that and make sure that your policies and procedures have all the stuff in there that they need to, and where they don't, figure out where that other documentation is and think about, do you need to submit that, or how would you work that into your policies and procedures in the future? So again, the scoring committee in terms of scoring is going to read through your answer and the documentation provided, and then they're going to decide whether you get the 2 points or the 0 points for each of those questions. Again, they're a little bit different, a lot of narratives that you're going to have to sort of write out the answer to. Be thoughtful and don't rush through it, but really be thinking about what is the answer that I'm providing here. And then this one is like a list. So we also ask if you have any formal relationships with education, childcare providers, employment, or vocational services, if you can describe that kind of stuff. That's also asked for in this question. All right, participation in CoC planning. The question in the application is this little statement here, but what it's going to say is, hey, go fill out the CoC planning and participation form that Erin put together. So be sure you submit that information. There's also another table on training, but really it's this attendance records on the CoC, and then whether you have a voting member that's going to drive your score. And having a voting member plus attending 4 CoC membership meetings is enough to get you 4 points. You might not have a voting member, that's fine. If you attended 2 or more meetings, you get 2 points. But if you don't have a voting member, haven't really attended many meetings, you'll get 0 points. Cost effectiveness is also on here. Please fill in this information and follow that. We're looking at FY19 budget here, so be sure you do follow those instructions. It's not scored, but the scoring committee does review it. And then for DV only, the rate of project households with a safety plan. The rate of projects households with a safety plan is going to be provided by the DV project. You'll just enter in that information, not scored this year, but the scoring committee would review that information. All right, questions. I talked a lot and said a lot of stuff. So if folks have questions about the criteria, anything that comes to mind, feel free to unmute and ask away.
I do also want to reiterate that a lot of the changes made this year were based off feedback from last year's competition, particularly around housing first and support services. So like Christy said, ahead of the TA meetings, please really look over those and come with any questions. And again, we'd like to reiterate that we really aligned them with a lot of the stuff that goes into the NOFA as well.
Yeah, and also for anybody who's familiar or who may want to do this, the Housing First, the HUD Housing First assessment tool and the usage Housing First sort of checklist. So we kind of pull these different aspects of Housing First and low barrier from these different pieces, but their root is back in sort of stuff that HUD is releasing and kind of saying, here are the things that we should be looking at when we're talking about housing first and low barrier approaches. So not just making this step up, it does come from folks who've really thought about it, worked on it a lot. And again, that housing first assessment tool is out there for any agency that wants to look at it, to try to use it. It's a good way to get a sense of the ways that your project or agency could improve when it comes to housing first.
And if anybody has any trouble finding it on the HUD Exchange, it is also posted on the CoC funding page as well.
I have a question. So for PSH, I believe, and if I heard correctly, hopefully, that utilization was not necessarily going to be scored for this year due to COVID.
Correct.
What about income?
No, income will be scored. I think the changes that were made including like having maintained income factored in, and also the sort of tweaks to the benchmarks to be more aligned with what we were seeing in the actual data should help. But again, no promises that every project will get points, but those changes were made, and we do have to have scoring on some common elements, right? So income is still there. It's just been tweaked in the ways that we discussed.
Okay, thank you. I was hoping they would take that into consideration with people losing their jobs because of COVID, so.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean, it's the reality. And I think part of it is the balance between in different CoCs and in prior years, right? HUD will look at income for earned income versus non-employment income. And what we're doing is saying any source of income, increased or maintained, and tweaking the benchmarks, right? So all of those things factored in together. So hopefully, that's enough to sort of, I don't know, level the playing field. Let's put it that way. I think that's what we're hoping to do. Other questions? Okay. Well, I'll leave it to others to close it out. But again, I hope this review is helpful. I hope it's helpful to talk through the different criteria. And again, reach out to Erin and don't miss your deadline. That's probably the most important piece of advice. But again, I guess my final thought is read through that submission checklist, make sure you're clear on what you need to submit. It only drags out the process when people submit the wrong documents, to be really honest. Like it's quite difficult in that way. So be sure you're submitting the right information, and the things that we've talked through in terms of, say, housing first and low barrier and all that stuff. Again, make sure that what you're submitting is going to help the scoring committee understand whether those are things that your agency is both doing and is backed up through your policies and procedures and things like that. And then my other thought is just, again, a lot of times folks are doing this on behalf of a project, but do not have all of the pieces of the puzzle. So leave yourself plenty of time to track down information from different folks as you need to, and to be able to pull together that application package. And particularly if you're new to this, ask a lot of questions. and get clarity rather than just sort of make assumptions or just not be sure and submit stuff just because you don't know. Erin is great and willing to answer lots of questions and draw up a list for that TA session and just be thoughtful about your responses.
Thank you so much, Christy. Your help is always very much appreciated. Again, if you guys have not answered the doodle poll yet or need me to resend it to you for the TA sessions, please do that as soon as possible. I want to get those on the books, and feel free to reach out to me any other time. Thank everybody for your time today, and good luck this year. See you later.
Bye, everyone.